Sarah was scrolling through her phone one evening when she received a text from her friend Bella's number. The message was simple: "Text me when you read this." Concerned, Sarah quickly replied, "What's wrong, Bella?" But the response that followed made her pause. Instead of Bella, the reply read, "This isn't Bella. I'm her Uber driver." The supposed Uber driver claimed that Bella had accidentally left her phone in his car and that he wanted to find a way to return it to her. He explained that he saw Sarah was the last person Bella had texted, so he decided to reach out for help. Sarah, fully aware of Bella's occasional carelessness, didn't find the story hard to believe. Bella was always leaving things behind: her wallet, her keys, and now, apparently, her phone. Trying to be helpful, Sarah responded, "That's so like Bella. Thanks for letting me know. Did she say anything before she got out of your car?" The man replied that he hadn't had much of a conversation with Bella and was just trying to return her phone as a good Samaritan. Then came the question that made Sarah hesitate: "Can I get your address? I'll drop the phone off at your place." For a moment, Sarah debated whether or not to share her address. Something about giving personal information to a stranger felt off, even if he was an Uber driver. But the more she thought about it, the less suspicious it seemed. After all, Bella's name and carelessness matched the situation perfectly. Maybe it wasn't a big deal. Reluctantly, Sarah texted back her address. Moments after sending the text, her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and saw it was Rebecca, another close friend. Picking up, she answered cheerfully, "Hey, Rebecca. What's up?" But Rebecca's voice was panicked and frantic, making Sarah's stomach drop. "Sarah," Rebecca began, her voice trembling, "Bella is dead." Sarah's blood turned cold. "What are you talking about?" Rebecca continued, "We went to Jessica's party tonight, and everything was fine until we got an Uber to take us home. At first, the ride seemed normal. The driver was quiet, but nothing felt wrong. Then, out of nowhere, the car stopped. He said something about needing to check under the hood, and we thought it was just car trouble." Sarah sat frozen, clutching her phone tightly as Rebecca continued, "But then he opened the trunk, grabbed a knife, and came straight for us. He stabbed Bella before we could even react. I barely escaped, Sarah. I ran as fast as I could and hid until I knew he was gone. I just got to safety and called you." Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing as Rebecca's words sank in. Slowly, she whispered, "Oh my God. Rebecca. The Uber driver texted me earlier. He said Bella left her phone in his car. He even asked for my address so he could drop it off here." Rebecca's sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. "Sarah, you didn't give him your address, did you?" "I did," Sarah admitted, her voice barely audible. "I thought he was just trying to help." "Sarah, listen to me," Rebecca said urgently. "He's lying. He's not trying to help. He's the killer. You need to get out of your house. Now." Sarah jumped to her feet, her pulse thundering in her ears. She rushed to her front door, and that's when she saw it, a car slowly pulling up in front of her house. The headlights illuminated the driveway, and the silhouette of the driver was just barely visible through the windshield. Her blood ran cold as she realized the horrifying truth. He had come for her. Heart pounding, Sarah dropped the phone and bolted for the back door, panic surging through her veins. But no matter how she tried to escape, the serial killer found her and killed her just like he killed Bella. Rebecca's voice came through the phone, still lying on the floor. "Sarah? Are you there? Sarah?" But the response she got was chilling, "She's dead. You were lucky you escaped." Hannah sat in her dimly lit living room, nervously glancing at the clock on the wall. She was anxiously awaiting the arrival of her boyfriend, someone she had met online a few months ago. Their relationship had started like a modern fairy tale, sweet texts, long conversations, and late-night calls that made her heart flutter. Tonight was supposed to be the first time they would meet in person, and while part of her was excited, a nagging fear tugged at the edges of her thoughts. Lately, the news had been filled with terrifying stories about online encounters gone horribly wrong. Just a few days ago, Hannah had read an article about a young woman who had been chatting with a man she met on a dating app. He seemed perfect, kind, attentive, and charming enough to earn her trust. Eventually, he asked for her address, claiming he wanted to see her in person and take their relationship to the next level. Thrilled by the idea of finally meeting the person she'd been connecting with for weeks, the woman agreed and shared her address. But when the man arrived, the situation turned into a nightmare. The charming stranger turned out to be a serial killer who brutally ended her life the moment she let her guard down. The story had chilled Hannah to the bone at the time, but she had reassured herself that such horrors couldn't happen to her. After all, her online boyfriend wasn't a stranger anymore. They had been chatting for months, and he had been nothing but kind and thoughtful. She had to be overthinking things, letting fear creep in because of one sensational news story. But as the hours ticked by and she continued waiting for him to arrive, the unease in her chest grew stronger. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a call from him. The sound of his voice, calm and steady, helped ease her nerves a little. "I'm almost there," he said, his tone reassuring. She smiled despite herself, pushing aside the lingering doubts. "Okay," she replied softly, "I can't wait to see you." After ending the call, Hannah busied herself by straightening up the room, fluffing the pillows on the couch, and glancing at her reflection in the mirror to smooth her hair. She told herself for the 100th time that she was being paranoid. This wasn't some horror movie, it was real life. He was real, and tonight would be the start of something amazing. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. She opened it to read the words, "I'm outside." A nervous smile tugged at her lips as she walked over to the window, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and lingering apprehension. Gently, she parted the blinds and peered outside. Her breath caught in her throat. There he was, standing just outside her house, illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. He was exactly as he had described himself, tall, with a lean build and wearing a plain black t-shirt. But as her eyes scanned him, something else caught her attention. In his left hand, glinting faintly under the light, was a large, sharp knife. Hannah's heart plummeted. Her body froze, unable to process what she was seeing. Every fear she had tried to brush aside came crashing back with devastating clarity. The story from the news flashed through her mind in vivid detail. The man outside her house wasn't the loving, kind boyfriend she had imagined. He was a predator. A serial killer. And she had just invited him to her doorstep. Panic surged through her as she dropped the blinds and stumbled backward, her breathing shallow and erratic. Her phone slipped from her trembling hands, clattering onto the floor. She tried to think, to come up with a plan, but her thoughts were clouded with terror. Then came the sound of footsteps on her porch, slow and deliberate. The door splintered apart with a deafening crash, and Hannah's scream caught in her throat. The man stepped inside, the dim light catching the blade in his hand, making it glint ominously. His face was no longer the kind, comforting image she had conjured during their chats. It was cold, predatory, devoid of the warmth she thought she had known. "Hannah," he called, his voice low, calm, and chilling. "I told you I'd come to see you. Isn't this what you wanted?" She scrambled backward on the floor, her phone slipping from her grip as panic overtook her. She reached for the closest thing she could find, a lamp on the side table, and clutched it with trembling hands. "Stay back," she cried, her voice shaking. He tilted his head, a sick, twisted smile spreading across his face. "You're even more beautiful in person," he said softly, as if the knife in his hand didn't contradict his words. Hannah tried to throw the lamp at him, but her fear made her clumsy. It slipped from her grasp, smashing uselessly against the floor. Before she could react, he lunged at her. The blade caught the faint light as it plunged downward. Hannah screamed, but the sound was abruptly cut off as he struck her. Pain exploded in her chest, sharp and overwhelming, stealing the air from her lungs. She struggled, her hands weakly pushing against him, but he was relentless. Blood pooled beneath her as her strength faded, her vision blurring. As the life drained from her, her thoughts were a whirlwind of regret and disbelief. She had trusted him, let him into her life, into her home. The warnings from the news now felt like cruel prophecies she had ignored. The last thing she saw was his cold, emotionless eyes staring back at her before everything went dark. Hannah's phone buzzed faintly on the floor where it had fallen, the 911 operator's voice echoing faintly from the line she had managed to connect but never finished the call. The man picked it up, stared at it for a moment, and then dropped it onto the pool of blood before stepping out into the night, vanishing as quickly as he had arrived. Jenna was racing against the clock, her heart pounding as she hurried to a very important meeting that could potentially change the course of her career. But just as she was about to focus on her presentation, a nagging realization hit her. She needed to find a babysitter to look after her son, Jacob. As a single mother, finding reliable care for her 13-year-old son had always been a challenge, especially given his growing sense of independence. However, Jenna couldn't shake the anxiety that came with leaving him home alone, even for a short period. Just as she was about to pull out her phone to call a babysitting service, she heard it, a sudden, sharp knock on her door that jolted her from her thoughts. Curiosity piqued, Jenna opened the door to find a woman standing there, a stranger who confidently claimed to be a babysitter. With a warm smile, the woman introduced herself, assuring Jenna that she was experienced and trustworthy. A wave of relief washed over Jenna. It felt as though fate had intervened just when she needed help the most. Without hesitation, she invited her inside and asked her to babysit Jacob for the night while she attended her meeting. Jenna felt a sense of gratitude, believing her worries were finally at ease. Moments later, as Jenna made her way through the busy streets toward the meeting, her phone buzzed insistently with a text message from her friend Amanda. The message was straightforward yet urgent, asking her where she was and stating that everyone was already at the venue waiting for her arrival. Jenna quickly typed a response, letting Amanda know that she was on her way but had been delayed trying to secure a babysitter for Jacob. Amanda's reply came almost immediately, filled with a mix of concern and disbelief. "Isn't Jacob old enough? I mean, he's 13 years old, does he still really need a babysitter?" she questioned, sounding skeptical of Jenna's apprehensions. A flush of defensiveness rose within Jenna as she explained her fears. Every time she left him home alone, her mind raced with worry about what could possibly go wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bad might happen if she wasn't there to keep an eye on him. However, Amanda's next message sent chills down Jenna's spine. She warned Jenna to be careful about who she let babysit her child, recalling a recent news story about a female serial killer who had been targeting families by posing as a babysitter. The chilling details of the report revealed that the last child the woman had babysat had nearly died at her hands, and although the police managed to intervene in time, the woman had somehow escaped custody. Jenna's heart raced as Amanda revealed the serial killer's name, Jennifer Jones. As soon as Jenna heard the name, a wave of panic washed over her. She remembered the woman who had knocked on her door, who had introduced herself as Jennifer. Jenna's pulse quickened as she realized the horrifying coincidence. This stranger sharing a name with a notorious criminal was now in her home, alone with her son. With a sense of dread tightening her chest, Jenna immediately texted Amanda back, her fingers trembling as she typed, relaying the unsettling revelation. Amanda replied instantly, urging her to get Jacob out of the house, insisting that the woman was not a babysitter but a dangerous predator masquerading as one. With a heavy heart and dread seeping into her thoughts, Jenna dialed Jacob's number, her heart racing as she prayed he would answer. When he picked up, she asked where he was, desperate to hear that he was safe. Jacob responded that he was in his room, absorbed in a video game, which momentarily eased Jenna's nerves. However, that relief was short-lived as she pressed him for the whereabouts of Jennifer. "I think she went to the kitchen," Jacob replied, his voice strangely calm. "What's wrong, Mom?" Panic surged through Jenna, and she hurriedly urged Jacob to get out of the house immediately. "Get out now, Jacob." "I'm on my way," she insisted, her voice rising with urgency. But as Jacob reached for the door, his voice turned frantic. "Mom, it's locked from the outside," he exclaimed, confusion and fear evident in his tone. At that moment, realization hit Jenna like a lightning bolt. Jennifer had locked her son inside, preventing him from escaping. Jenna's heart raced as she instructed him to call the police and to find a way out through the window. "You have to move fast," she urged, her voice trembling with anxiety. But just as she was about to hang up, Jacob's tone shifted to one of sheer terror. "Mom, I hear something," he whispered, fear palpable in his voice. Jenna felt her stomach drop as he continued, "The door, it's opening. Jacob. You need to get out of there. Run to the neighbors." Jenna shouted frantically, her mind racing as she pictured the worst-case scenarios. But then, a piercing scream erupted through the phone, a sound that cut through Jenna like a knife. "Jacob. Are you okay?" she yelled into the phone, but the line fell silent. The sudden absence of his voice filled Jenna with dread, a suffocating sense of panic enveloping her. As Jenna finally arrived home, her mind raced with frantic thoughts. She rushed inside, desperately searching the house for any sign of Jacob, calling out his name into the eerie silence. But despite her frantic efforts, Jacob was nowhere to be found, and the weight of fear settled heavily on her chest. The reality of the situation began to sink in. She had let a predator into her home, and her son was missing. Each second felt like an eternity as she realized she might have just made the worst mistake of her life. Hannah went on a blind date with a guy she met on Facebook, someone who had seemed perfectly charming and normal during their months of online conversations. They had spent countless evenings chatting, getting to know each other, and sharing pieces of their lives in a way that made Hannah feel like she had known him forever, even though they had never met in person. That fateful evening, filled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, Hannah found herself at the meeting point they had agreed upon, a cozy, well-lit cafe in the middle of town. While waiting for her blind date to arrive, she decided to call her best friend, Sarah, to pass the time and share her excitement. The conversation quickly turned into Sarah expressing her concern about the idea of meeting someone from the internet in real life. Sarah's tone was filled with worry as she told Hannah that she didn't like the idea of her going on a date with a guy she barely knew and had only met online, emphasizing that it was too risky and dangerous. Hannah, however, was quick to dismiss Sarah's apprehension, insisting that she knew Michael well because of their long conversations and countless exchanges over the past few months. "I know him very well, Sarah. We've been talking for months. He's not a stranger," she said confidently, trying to reassure her friend. But Sarah was not convinced, and her voice carried a note of urgency as she asked, "What if he's not who he says he is? What if he's dangerous?" Hannah rolled her eyes, brushing aside Sarah's warnings as unnecessary overreacting, and said in a light-hearted tone, "You always think of the worst-case scenario, Sarah. Stop being so negative. Everything will be fine, I promise." Just as Sarah was about to reply, Hannah spotted Michael walking toward her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hurriedly told Sarah, "He's here. I have to go," before ending the call without waiting for a response. She stood up, greeted Michael with a warm smile, and the two began their date, which seemed to go perfectly. They laughed, shared stories, and had lively conversations as though they had known each other for years. It felt like a dream come true for Hannah, who couldn't help but think she had finally met someone she could really connect with. As the evening came to an end and they prepared to say goodbye, Michael casually suggested that she come over to his place, mentioning how much he wanted to spend a little more time with her. Although she hesitated at first, unsure if it was a good idea, Michael's charm and insistence eventually convinced her to accept his invitation. They arrived at his house, a quiet, unassuming place on a deserted street, and settled on the couch to watch a movie together. The atmosphere was cozy, and Hannah began to relax, telling herself that she had been right to trust him and that Sarah's fears were completely unfounded. As they sat together, Michael suddenly excused himself, saying he was going to the kitchen to grab more wine. Hannah smiled and nodded, thinking nothing of it. But when Michael returned, he wasn't carrying wine, he was holding a knife, his eyes cold and menacing, completely unlike the charming man she had been laughing with just moments before. Panic surged through Hannah as she realized the danger she was in. Before she could fully process what was happening, Michael lunged at her, slashing her arm as she instinctively tried to defend herself. The pain was sharp and immediate, but adrenaline took over, and Hannah managed to push him away and run toward the front door, desperate to escape. Her hands fumbled with the lock, but no matter what she did, the door wouldn't budge. She felt trapped, her heart racing as she frantically searched for another way out. She ran down the hall, her mind racing with terror, and spotted an open door leading to one of the rooms in the house. Without thinking, she darted inside and quickly shut the door behind her, her shaking hands locking it as she tried to catch her breath. In the corner of the room, she crouched down and pulled out her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice came through the line, calm yet urgent. 911, what is your emergency? Hannah's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear as she replied, there's a man. He has a knife. He's trying to kill me. The operator's tone grew more serious as they assured her, stay on the line. Officers are on their way. For a brief moment, Hannah felt a glimmer of hope, but that hope quickly evaporated when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the room. They were slow and deliberate, each step growing louder and closer, sending chills down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized Michael was coming for her. Before she could react, the door burst open with terrifying force, and Michael stormed into the room, his face twisted with rage. He grabbed Hannah by her hair, yanking her to her feet as she screamed in terror, but her cries were quickly silenced when he pressed the cold blade of the knife against her throat. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to free herself, but Michael's grip was unrelenting. She tried to plead with him, but the words wouldn't come. In one swift, brutal motion, Michael's knife sliced across her throat, ending her life in a horrifying instant. The room fell silent, save for the sound of Hannah's phone hitting the floor, the operator's voice faintly calling her name on the other end of the line. Emily always had a strange feeling about her neighbor. He was quiet, kept to himself, and often brought different women home late at night. It seemed normal at first, but soon Emily began noticing a chilling pattern. After his guests arrived, later in the night, around midnight, she would hear screams from his house, followed by an eerie silence. She couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. One night, Emily saw her neighbor arrive home with another woman. She watched from her window as the two entered his house, her stomach churning with unease. Determined to confirm her fears, she stayed awake that night, sitting by her window and keeping a close watch on the house next door. Hours passed in silence until, just after midnight, she heard it, a scream piercing through the still night air. Her heart raced as she looked toward the neighbor's house, and then she saw him. He emerged into the backyard, dragging a large bundle wrapped in a tarp. Emily froze, horrified, as he began digging a hole. She could hardly breathe as she watched him lower the bundle into the ground and start covering it with dirt. Terrified, Emily screamed but immediately covered her mouth. However, the scream had already escaped. Her neighbor stopped digging. Slowly, he turned his head and looked directly at her window. Emily ducked out of sight, her heart pounding so loudly she thought he might hear it. Just as she was about to go to her bedroom to get her phone and call the police, she heard it, a knock at her door. At first, it was soft and deliberate, but soon it escalated into frantic, heavy banging. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. She knew it was her neighbor who was banging on her door. The banging grew louder, and she could hear the doorknob rattling as he tried to force his way in. Emily fled to her bedroom and hid in her closet, clutching her phone with trembling hands. She managed to call the police, whispering her address and explaining what was happening. The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. The banging on her front door stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. Then, she heard it, soft footsteps inside her apartment. Her blood ran cold. He had found another way in. The footsteps grew louder, heading toward her bedroom. She held her breath as she heard the doorknob turn. The door creaked open, and the intruder's heavy breathing filled the room. Emily pressed herself deeper into the corner of the closet, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Just as she thought she was moments away from being discovered, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and she heard the man retreat. Her neighbor tried to run, but the police caught him at the entrance to her door, pointing several guns at him and telling him to put his hands up and get down on the ground. The police quickly apprehended her neighbor, and investigators uncovered multiple shallow graves in his backyard, each containing the remains of his victims. Emily's suspicions had been horrifyingly accurate. Her neighbor was a serial killer. Though the ordeal was over, Emily knew she would never forget the terror of that night. The memory of his cold, calculating eyes, and the sound of his footsteps outside her closet would haunt her for the rest of her life.